Franklin Roosevelt stood in the middle of New York City and looked up at buildings that scraped the sky. He didn't need to say a word for the moment to feel heavy. This was his city's heartbeat: steel, stone, and ambition. It is the kind of place people think was always meant to be tall, owned by families who were always meant to be rich. But here is the secret that flips the story. Under those streets, under the concrete, and under the exact spot where the Empire State Building sits today, his family once owned a farm. A real farm. It had fields, and boundaries and dirt that got under your fingernails. The penalty, if you don't know this, is that you keep thinking the Roosevelts were born into marble. You see the end of the movie and miss the beginning. The reward for digging deeper is seeing the truth. The most powerful political dynasty in American history started with a man named Klaus, who arrived with almost nothing. Klaus Martensen van Roosevelt stepped onto the docks of New Amsterdam sometime between 1638 and 1649. That range of dates tells you something right away. People weren't keeping perfect records of him because he wasn't important yet. Life moved fast in the colony, and settlers moved faster. Klaus likely came with limited means. He didn't arrive as a governor or a merchant prince. He worked at first as a farmer or a laborer. That is not a glamour job. It is the kind of work that keeps you alive and keeps your hands rough. It forces you to learn patience and grit, because if you don't work, you don't eat. That was his first problem. He was in a new place, without established power. In a colony, land is everything, but it isn't handed out like candy. You need money, connections, or timing. Klaus had to build a life before he could even dream of building a legacy. Then the chance opened. Around 1652, Klaus bought a farm from a man named Lambert van Valkenburg. It was about 48 acres. Think about that size in modern terms. It is not a backyard, it is a massive slice of the island. The farm's origin story is already packed with drama. Lambert the seller had received the land from the colony's director, Patrus Stuyvesant. When Lambert moved north to Albany for new opportunities, the land became available. Klaus took his shot. He likely bought it through barter or a simple exchange because hard currency was rare in the young colony. This farm sat on what became Midtown Manhattan, roughly between 29th and 35th Streets, from 5th to Lexington Avenues. This fact alone is the moment that makes you blink. The place you now think of as the ultimate city was once the Roosevelt ancestors' cornfield. It takes a famous modern landmark and peels it backward into dirt and fences. But Klaus didn't hold it forever. He died in 1679, and while his children inherited the land, it eventually reverted to city, common lands, and was broken up. The Roosevelts didn't get rich by holding that one specific plot for 300 years. They got rich because Klaus planted a different kind of seed. He planted a family that knew how to survive, adapt, and climb. The family didn't stay in the fields. Over the next 2 centuries, they moved into the engine room of New York. They realized that in a port city, the real money wasn't in growing crops. It was in moving goods. Klaus's descendants became sugar refiners. This is the dark part of the money story that is often skipped. Sugar refining in that era relied on imports from the Caribbean, which meant the wealth was tied to slave labor. That is a stain that doesn't wash out, even if the later Roosevelts became champions of freedom. It shows that the foundation of the dynasty was built on the hard, sometimes brutal realities of global trade. They didn't stop at sugar. They went into hardware, linseed oil, and dry goods. These aren't flashy businesses, but they are the bones of a city. Everyone needs tools. Everyone needs oil. Everyone needs goods. The family made themselves essential. Then they leveled up. They moved into banking and real estate. Isaac Daniel Roosevelt, Franklin's great-grandfather, co-founded the Bank of New York. That is not a small claim. A bank is power. A co-founder is a builder of that power. By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born, the family had done something strategic. They had split into two branches. This is the part that confuses people who only know the famous names. They assume the Roosevelts were one big happy clan. They weren't. They were two rival teams sharing a jersey. The split started way back with two of Klaus's grandsons, Johannes and Jacobus. Johannes settled in Oyster Bay on Long Island. His line went into trade and glass and eventually became Republicans. This is the branch that produced Theodore Roosevelt. Jacobus settled in Hyde Park along the Hudson River. His line focused on mercantile success and landed gentry life, eventually becoming Democrats. This is the branch that produced Franklin. So you have two Roosevelts, Oyster Bay and Hyde Park, one Republican, one Democrat, one loud and energetic, one smooth and patrician. They were fifth cousins, which sounds distant, but in the tight circles of New York elite society, they were constantly bumping into each other, and they didn't just rely on their own money. They married into other powerful families like the Delanos and the Livingstons. This wasn't just romance, it was a survival strategy. Wealth in America can disappear in one bad generation. A spendthrift son or a bad investment can wipe it out. The Roosevelts avoided this by building a web. They married women from families who also had money, history, and connections. The Delanos brought wealth from the opium trade in China, another hard truth about the source of the capital. The Livingstons brought colonial prestige. These marriages acted like safety nets. If one business failed, the network held you up. This is the world Theodore Roosevelt stepped into. He didn't have to invent the idea of leadership. He was born into a family that had been practicing it for 200 years. But he brought something new, pure, explosive energy. He charged through the New York Police Department and the governorship, and by 1901 he was president. He was the Oyster Bay Roosevelt, the man of action. Then there was Franklin. He grew up in the Hyde Park branch, surrounded by the quiet confidence of the Hudson Valley aristocracy. He didn't run around like Teddy. He floated. He went to Groton and Harvard, places that were networks in human form. He learned how to speak to power because he had been listening to it across the dinner table his whole life. But the most fascinating moment in this family history isn't an election, it's a wedding. In 1905, Franklin Roosevelt married Eleanor Roosevelt. This is where the family tree folds back on itself like a piece of paper. Eleanor was not just a random woman, she was Theodore Roosevelt's niece. She was also Franklin's fifth cousin once removed. When they married, the two rival branches, Oyster Bay and Hyde Park, were tied together in a knot that the public couldn't look away from. The wedding was the ultimate Roosevelt moment. Theodore Roosevelt, the sitting president of the United States, attended. He didn't just sit in the front row, he gave the bride away. Eleanor's father was dead, so her Uncle Teddy stepped in. Imagine the scene. The most famous man in the world standing between the bride and groom, who were both Roosevelts. He famously said it was a good thing to keep the name in the family. It looked like unity. It looked like a dynasty cementing its power. But under the surface, the tension was already bubbling. Eleanor had deep, painful reasons to resent the Oyster Bay side of the family, even though she was born into it. Her father, Elliot, had been an alcoholic. Theodore, trying to protect the family reputation and the children, had intervened and separated Elliot from his family. He thought he was doing the right thing, but for a young Eleanor, it felt like her uncle was the reason she lost her father. She carried that resentment for the rest of her life, so when she married Franklin, she wasn't just marrying a cousin, she was marrying into the rival branch. She was stepping away from the Oyster Bay domination and helping to build the Hyde Park legend. The split between the branches eventually turned into open political warfare. It wasn't a polite disagreement, it was a feud. In 1924, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Teddy's son, ran for governor of New York. He wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. Franklin and Eleanor decided to stop him. They didn't just campaign for the other guy, they sabotaged him. Eleanor and Franklin used the Teapot Dome scandal, a massive corruption case involving oil leases, to attack Theodore Jr. They even used a teapot prop in the campaign to mock him. It was brutal. It was personal. Theodore Jr. was furious. He publicly called Franklin a maverick who was unfit for the family brand. He said Franklin didn't deserve the name. The Oyster Bay Roosevelts viewed Franklin and Eleanor as betrayers. They felt that Franklin had stolen the political spotlight that belonged to Teddy's sons. This is the penalty for thinking the Roosevelts were one big team. You missed the drama. The rivalry between the cousins was sharper than the rivalry between the political parties. They were fighting over who owned the name. Franklin, for his part, didn't let the feud stop him. In fact, he used the family history to build his own armor. He was obsessed with genealogy. This wasn't a casual hobby for him. It was a way of proving he was the real thing. He traced his line all the way back to Klaus in the 1640s. He collected family trees and displayed them at his library next to his naval collections. Why did he do that? Because it gave him a weapon that money couldn't buy. It gave him legitimacy. When he traced his line to 1649, he was telling the world, "I was here before the country was a country." He called himself old stock. It fed a sense of superiority. He believed he was chosen by history to lead. This belief is what allowed him to do the most surprising thing of his career. When the Great Depression hit, Franklin turned against the very class of people he came from. He attacked the economic royalists. He went after the bankers and the tycoons. These were the people he had gone to school with. These were his neighbors. They called him a traitor to his class. They hated him. But Franklin didn't care. Because of his genealogy, because of Klaus, because of the 300 years of history he had memorized, he didn't need their approval to feel important. He already knew who he was. He was a Roosevelt. He used his privilege to fight the privileged. That is the twist. His arrogance, born from his ancestry, gave him the confidence to save the system by changing it. And there is one final secret about that name they fought over. Roosevelt sounds fancy to American ears. It sounds like money, but if you translate it from the original Dutch, it brings you right back to the earth. Van Roosevelt means from the rose field. It wasn't a title, it was an address. It referred to a specific patch of land in the Dutch village of Oud-Vossemeer in Zeeland, a place where wild roses grew. The family coat of arms features 3 roses on a green field. It is a visual pun. Even as they became presidents and power brokers, their name kept whispering the truth about where they started. Not in a castle, but in a field. The Zeeland area was land that had to be fought for. It was low country, protected by dikes and polders. Survival depended on managing the water and working the soil. That is the DNA of the name. It is about holding ground. So when you look at the Roosevelts now, don't just see the portraits in the White House. Look at the timeline. See Klaus arriving in New Amsterdam, a man with muddy boots and a dream of owning land. See him buying that farm under the Empire State Building. See the family building a fortune on sugar and hardware, brick by brick. See the split that sent one cousin to Oyster Bay and one to Hyde Park. See the wedding where the branches tried to heal the rift, and the political war where they tore it open again. And finally, see Franklin D. Roosevelt, the man who collected his ancestors like trophies. He stood up when his legs could no longer hold him, powered by the belief that his family was part of the bedrock of America. He was right, but not because they were royalty. They were part of the bedrock because they were there when the digging started. They didn't start as a myth. They started as a location, a rose field. And from that small plot, they grew a story big enough to hold 2 presidents, 2 parties, and the history of the American century. That is the reward for knowing the whole story. You realize that dynasties aren't magic. They are just families that refuse to stop climbing.